All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book, real quick, YouTube served me up the Richard Spencer Michael Tracy interview today. It's kind of a long one, but if you're still bugging out about the Epstein stuff, I would definitely suggest checking that video out. I put the link in the description as well. And also, just on time, I got Academic Agent's book that I ordered, Applied Elite Theory. Looks pretty freaking interesting, actually. I'll just read the back here. In Applied Elite Theory, Nima Parvini brings the arguments of the populist delusion and the prophets of doom into direct confrontation with contemporary political reality. Drawing from over 40 essays and speeches written between 2022 and 2025, Parvini tests the central claims of classical elite theory, derived from Mosca, Pareto, and Michaels, against the tumult of present-day events in Britain, America, and beyond. Parvini's premise is simple. Populism is the thickest of all delusions. Power never flows upward. It is always exercised by an organized minority, and every movement that forgets this truth is destined for capture. Across 3 sections, he shows this pattern repeating. In America, the populist wave surrounding Donald Trump succumbs to the iron law of oligarchy, transforming from rebellion to empty formalisms within a single political cycle. In Britain, Tony Blair's enduring influence and the hollow collapse of the Conservative Party reveals an establishment that has survived every supposed change of regime. Throughout, Parvini's tone is unsparing yet analytical, combining political realism with cultural diagnosis. The collection also documents Parvini's own evolution from early engagement with the dissonant right to a disillusioned realism that sees even online radicalism as a new form of containment. Written originally for his Substack, The Forbidden Text, his Chronicles column, Riding the Tiger, and public lectures, these pieces gain new coherence in print. Together they map a world in which ideology masks interest, elites recycle themselves beneath shifting symbols, and history vindicates the cynics of power. Applied Elite Theory continues Parvini's work on power, decline, and belief. If the populist delusion was theory and the prophets of doom history, this is practice, a guided tour through the politics of the 2020s, showing how elite theory predicts, explains, and perhaps forecloses on the hopes of populism itself. Sounds pretty good. And it's made by Imperial. It's printed by Imperium Press at imperiumpress.org. If you want to check it out. I also like the design on the cover. It's got that like vaporwave aesthetics going on there. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. Oh yeah, it's like 200-something pages too. So yeah, that's that. Gonna get into the book now. On the final chapter. Still on The Future in Perspective, page 1292, second paragraph down. Only a very small group of Frenchmen share de Gaulle's idea that the new system of France, the Fifth Republic, should make national power and glory its primary aim. A larger and surprisingly influential group, best represented by Monet, wishes to work for the kind of rational humanism or unified diversity that this volume has used as its chief criterion for judging historical change. This group hopes, by the proper organization of men and resources, to increase the production of wealth and to reduce the conflicts over power sufficiently to remove these distracting matters from the center of human concern so that once prosperity and peace have been relatively secured, men will find the time and energy to turn their more important ends of personality development, artistic expression, and intellectual exploration. This point of view, based on a significant distinction between what is necessary and what is important, hopes to find the opportunity to turn to important matters once the necessary ones have achieved a level of minimal satisfactions. That would be great if AI wasn't taking over all artistic expression and intellectual exploration. That would have been great to free men up to do that, but obviously they were never going to do that. The Frenchmen of the third group, which includes the major part of the population, have little concern with the goals of de Gaulle and even less with those of Monet, but are concerned with an almost repulsive pursuit of material affluence, something of which they had long heard but never considered achievable before. Today, for the first time, such affluence seems achievable to the great mass of Frenchmen as it does to the great mass of West Germans, to many English, and to increasing number of Italians. Americans and Swedes, who are already disillusioned with the fruits of affluence, must be indulgent to these recent arrivals in the materialist rat race. The chief political aim of this large group is for the political stability free from partisan upheavals, an end that de Gaulle and the Fifth Republic seem more capable of securing than the unstable, multi-partied Fourth Republic. Much of the ambiguity about de Gaulle rests on a failure of historical synchronisms. This can be seen in regard to the three aspects of A. Political ideology, B. Economic management, and C. The relationship between these two. In the 1920s, all three of these were antipathetic to de Gaulle's outlook, since 40 years ago the three were A. A democratic, nationalist, sovereign, independent state pursuing the goal of national self-interest, B. A capitalistic economy, and C. Laissez-faire relationship of no government and business. De Gaulle's ideas are rather those of Louis XIV, that is, A. A sovereign, independent, authoritarian state pursuing the goal of national glory, B. A mixed economy of corporative sort, and C. Political domination of economic life. The point of view of the new Europeans on these matters was A. A democratic, cooperative political structure of shared and divided powers on a European basis, seeking peace and stability in an interlocking organizational structure rising through European, Atlantic, Western, and worldwide levels. B. A mixed economy, and C. A planned, state-directed drive towards increased affluence. De Gaulle cares only for A and has little interest in B or C, so long as they provide him with a rate of economic expansion capable of supporting his ambitions in A. The mass of French people care little about de Gaulle's ambitions in A, so long as they obtain political stability that will allow them to seek the affluence they wish from C, while the technicians concerned largely with B are prepared to let de Gaulle seek glory in A and the people seek affluence in C, so long as both leave them alone to manage the proper mixture of the economy they desire in B. Thus, France, by this most extraordinary mixture of cross purposes, is led into the future by a man whose ideas in all three areas are almost completely obsolete. It is easy for English-speaking persons to condemn de Gaulle. Many of them consider his obsolescent ideas a danger to Europe and to the world. Indeed, they are, but this does not mean that they do not have some basis in de Gaulle's personal experience and in the recent history of France itself. The general was determined to restore the power and prestige of France as an independent state within a context of national states similar to that in which France had suffered the blows to its prestige in 1919 to 1945. To him, these defeats were almost personal psychic injuries that could be repaired only by new French triumphs in the same nationalistic context and not by successes in an entirely different context, such as that of an integrated Europe. Obsessed by the pursuit of the glory of France in the nationalistic era, in which his own character had been formed, and personally piqued by the rebuffs he had received in his own career, the rejection of his military advice by his superiors in the 1920s and 1930s, the defeats of France in the diplomatic and military arenas in the period 1936 to 1940, the rebuffs administered by the United States Department of State and the White House to his efforts to make himself the leader of the Free French in 1940 to 1943, and finally the general belittling, as he saw it, to his ideas and dignity during the liberation. All these served to make his outlook more remote, more rigid, and more opinionated until he came to regard himself as the God given leader for a revived France and came to regard the English speaking nations as the chief obstacles in his path to this end. The culmination of de Gaulle's irritation with the United States came during the 5 years 1953 to 1958, during which he was retired from public life and had to watch, in helpless impotence, John Foster Dulles' studied belittling of France's role in world affairs. The American Secretary of State's unilateralism and brinksmanship, his emphasis on the Far East, and his ignoring of Europe, his refusal to consult with his NATO allies, and his lack of sympathy for the French position in Indochina, Algeria, and Europe itself, all this drove de Gaulle into an icy antipathy for American policy and a conviction that the interest of France could be protected only by France itself and could be furthered as well by collaboration with the Soviet Union as by alliance with the United States. De Gaulle was especially irritated by the American lack of concern for French and European interest in nuclear weapons policy. Dulles' willingness to go to war with the communist powers over Asiatic questions, such as the Chinese offshore islands or the Formosa Strait, without consultation with its European allies, when the most immediate consequence of any Soviet American war would be a Russian attack on Europe, and the exposure of France to a threat of nuclear attack over an issue on which Paris had not even been consulted, gave de Gaulle perfectly justifiably profound irritation. When the disruption of French political life over the Algerian dispute brought de Gaulle back to public life as premier in June 1958, he took steps to end the situation. What he wanted was a Western Troika, that is, a tripart consultation of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, all on world disputes that could involve NATO in war in Europe. In this way, he hoped to prevent in the future such events as Dulles' unilateral cancellation of the American offer of credits for the Aswan Dam that led to the Suez Crisis of 1956. This suggestion by de Gaulle was rebuffed and led by logical steps to his decision to disentangle France from its NATO obligations and to establish an independent French nuclear force de frappe. According to de Gaulle's line of thought, Washington not only ignored French interests and ideas on a worldwide basis, but involved it without consultation in the risk of war in Europe. The general also argued that the growth of nuclear stalemate between the United States and the Soviet Union left Europe unprotected so long that it based its security on an American threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Washington, he felt, would not reply to Soviet aggression in Europe by any nuclear attack on the Soviet Union when it realized that the Soviet counter-reply to such an attack would be the nuclear devastation of American cities by Soviet missiles. Why, according to de Gaulle, would the United States destroy its own cities in retaliation for a Soviet aggression at any level on Europe? This opened the whole problem of nuclear credibility with de Gaulle at such a high level of skepticism of American good faith that he saw little credibility and thus little deterrent value in the American threat to use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union to defend France. According to de Gaulle, the only secure French defense must be based on France's own military power, which must inevitably be nuclear power. At first glance, the idea of a modest French nuclear armaments serving as deterrents to the mighty Soviet threat of Europe, either conventional or nuclear, seems even less credible, but de Gaulle was one of the first to recognize as a feasible policy an idea that was subsequently adopted by the Soviet Union itself. This was the idea that a nuclear deterrence does not require the possession of overwhelming nuclear power, or even the nuclear superiority in which Washington long believed, but may be based on the capacity to inflict unacceptable nuclear damage. In de Gaulle's mind, the explosion of French hydrogen bombs over 3 or 4 major Soviet cities, including Moscow, would constitute unacceptable damage in the Kremlin's eyes and would thus provide effective deterrence against the Soviet aggression in Europe, or at least against France, without any need for France to rely on any uncertain American response. To provide for such a French threat of nuclear response to Soviet aggression, de Gaulle's regime accepted the great economic and financial burden of obtaining a force de frappe in its first stage to be achieved by 1966. This would consist of 62 Mirage 4 supersonic manned jet bombing planes to carry France's first generation 60 kiloton plutonium bombs. By the end of 1964, when 20 of these planes were operational, they were being produced at a rate of one a month and were being matched by the production of one bomb a month from the atomic pile at Maricule. Don't know that one. By 1966, the power of the bomb is expected to increase to its maximum size of about 300 kilotons. The Mirage 4 as a vehicle for the French nuclear threat will be replaced by 25 land-based missiles fired from underground silos. These will be operational about 1969 and will shift their warheads from A bombs to H bombs sometime in early 1970s. The third generation of French nuclear weapons will probably be Polaris-type nuclear submarines to become operational sometime in the 1970s. If these can be speeded up and the Mirage 4 could be retained, it is possible that the brief transition stage of land-based missiles might be skipped completely. The total nuclear submarine fleet will probably not exceed 3 vessels, even in the late 1970s. These plans do not seem impressive in comparison with the nuclear armaments of the two superpowers, but they are expected to make France an independent nuclear power and allow it to exercise an independent nuclear deterrence. However, if countermeasures, such as the development of an anti-missile missile, become more successful, the additional penetration devices needed to allow the French nuclear threat to be credible may raise the financial cost of the whole effort to a level that would put a severe strain on the French budget. In that case, France must either give up the effort or try to persuade the European community to do it as a joint effort. This might reactivate the West European Union or fall to the largest fragment of a divided NATO. But in this case, France, despite de Gaulle, will have to accept some kind of European political union. All of this points up the fact that the future political and military structure of Europe revolves about two quite separate problems. One, will it be a united Europe or a Europe of national states, as de Gaulle wants? And two, will it be aligned with the United States or will it be an independent neutralist factor in the Cold War? The United States wants Europe to be united and allied. De Gaulle wants it to be disunited and independent. The Kremlin wants it disunited and neutral. London's policy until 1960 was to see it disunited and allied to the Atlantic system. It seems likely, for reasons already given, that Europe's interests and those of the world as a whole might be served best if Europe could be united and independent. Moreover, in view of the conflicting forces involved, it seems very likely that Europe, after a considerable delay caused by de Gaulle, will finally emerge as united and independent. Thus, the future of Europe, like that of France itself, depended in the mid 60s on de Gaulle's continuance in office. This was ensured at least until the next presidential election in 1965, unless interrupted by death, by the fact that no alternative to de Gaulle could be seen clearly, even by his opponents. In the early 1960s, the political pattern of France was dominated by four factors. One, the terrorism of the extreme right, led by the secret army organization OAS, which resisted the Algerian settlement even after it was completed in 1962 and made several efforts to assassinate de Gaulle. Two, the disorganization and discontent of the older political leaders as de Gaulle continued to change French politics to a simple administrative structure with himself as an almost monarchical figure standing as a symbol of France above political considerations. Three, the steady, if not always enthusiastic, support of de Gaulle by the passive mass of Frenchmen who saw the general as a center of solidity in the middle of a sea of confusions. And four, the unpredictable and despotic control of the political initiative by de Gaulle himself. The chief discontents came in 1960 and 1961 from those groups in the population, notably farmers, civil servants, and university students, who found that they were sharing in the economic boom less than others or were being squeezed by its dynamics. The price inflation of about 50% in the decade following 1953 injured government employees whose salaries did not rise as rapidly as prices. University students were also squeezed by the inflation, but were squeezed much more literally in housing, eating accommodations, and classroom space by a great increase in enrollments, which was not sufficiently prepared for by government efforts to increase facilities. And the peasants, encouraged by government technocrats to modernize their methods, found that increased production led to lower farm prices and decreased incomes for themselves. In view of the authoritarian character of de Gaulle's regime, these discontents tended to become extra-legal agitations. There were sporadic strikes, protest parades, and even riots of these groups to call public attention to their grievances. Farmers were particularly violent when agricultural prices decreased and industrial prices continued to inch upward. The Gaullist government hoped to remedy the situation by reducing the cost of distribution through middlemen and thus provide French farmers with an increasing share of the reduced price of produce to the consumer, but on the whole, the insufficient distribution of French farm produce, which forced most produce, regardless of source or destination, to pass through the Parisian markets, was too difficult a problem even for de Gaulle's experts, at least in any time interval that mattered. To obtain concessions, the farmers rioted, often on a large scale, such as an outburst of 3,500 of them at Amiens in February 1960. They blocked national automobile routes with their tractors, spread unsold or unremuneratively priced farm produce all over the roads or city streets, and responded with violence when efforts were made to disperse them. Through this whole period, de Gaulle's conduct of the government, through his hand-picked prime ministers, made a shambles of the Fifth Republic Constitution, which had been tailored to his specifications. Since a government could not be overthrown by defeat of a bill, but only by a specific vote of censure, and this latter would lead to a general election in which all of de Gaulle's prestige could be used against those who had voted for the censure. The ordinary deputy's love of office and reluctance to wage an expensive and risky electoral campaign made it possible for de Gaulle's premiers to obtain almost any law he desired. The older political leaders were very restive under this system, but could mobilize no organized opposition to it, because no one could see any real alternative to de Gaulle. A significant example of de Gaulle's high-handed operations may be seen in the way he forced through the bill to create an independent French nuclear force without allowing the Assembly to debate the issue or to vote on the bill itself, November to December 1960. This was done under Article 49 of the Constitution, which allows the government to pass a bill on its own responsibility without consideration by the Assembly unless a vote of censure is passed by a majority, 277, of all the deputies. By use of this article, the 3 readings of the Nuclear Arms Bill were replaced by 3 motions of censure that obtained no more than 215 votes. There seems to have been a clear majority, both in the Assembly and in the country as a whole, against the nuclear force, but few were willing to risk the fall of the government with no acceptable alternative in sight, and even fewer were willing to precipitate a general election. As might be expected in such a system, the danger of assassination as a method for changing a government increased greatly, but de Gaulle continued on his imperturbable course in spite of a number of attempts on his life. One of the chief dangers to the Gaullist regime came from the discontent of the highest officers in the armed forces, but the mutiny and revolt of several army contingents in Algeria in April 1961 showed fairly clearly that this opposition movement was largely restricted to the highest officers, and de Gaulle was able to eliminate them and thus to reduce them, like the rest of his opponents, to angry impotence or to assassination efforts. De Gaulle's success in retiring from public life, the only surviving Marshal of France, Alphonse Juin, clinched his superiority over the army. Equally successful and typical of de Gaulle's actions were his constant appeals to public opinion by television or on personal regional tours or by local elections or plebiscites against the disunited opposition, especially against the traditional political party leaders. A successful example of these techniques occurred in 1962 when de Gaulle decided to change the method of electing the president or re-electing himself from the constitutional method of choice by an electoral college of 80,000 notables to election by popular vote. To bypass the Senate, which was constitutionally entitled to vote on such matters and would, unquestionably reject the change, de Gaulle announced that the amendment would be submitted to a popular referendum of the whole electorate. This method of changing the Constitution by referendum was denounced as unconstitutional by all the political parties except his own, and was declared illegal by the Council of State. Gaston Monnerville, President of the Senate, who would become President of France if de Gaulle died, denounced the referendum as illegal and accused de Gaulle of malfeasance. When de Gaulle's rage at Monnerville became evident, the Senate re-elected Monnerville as its presiding officer with only 3 dissenting votes. The Assembly, in an overnight session, October 4th through 5th, 1962, passed a vote of censure with 280 votes. By the referendum on the constitutional change on October 28, 1962, de Gaulle achieved his purpose with almost 62% of the votes registering ayes. This was only 46% of the registered votes because of the 23% non voting, in spite of the fact that his proposal was opposed by all political parties except his own. The following month, November 1962, in the general election made necessary by the vote of censure, de Gaulle's bloc won 234 seats out of 480, with an additional 41 seats committed to his support. The right was practically wiped out in the election, although the communists increased slightly to 41 seats. This pattern of personal and rather arbitrary rule, opposed by the older ruling groups, but sustained by the ordinary Frenchman whenever de Gaulle asked for such support, has continued to be the pattern of de Gaulle's political system and will undoubtedly continue unless he meets some unforeseen, sharp diplomatic defeat or domestic economic collapse. Both of these are unlikely at the present time. While French political life passed through these stages of superficial drama and fundamental boredom, British political life wallowed in a malaise of mediocrity. No groups were actually discontented, and certainly none was enthusiastic about the situation in Britain over the 1957 to 1964 period leading up to the general election of October 1964. The Conservative government came to office in 1951, was returned in the elections of 1955, and returned again in the elections of October 1959. Anthony Eden served a brief and rather unsuccessful prime ministership from the retirement of Winston Churchill in April 1955 until his own retirement in favor of Harold Macmillan in January 1957. The latter's term of office had no spectacular failures, such as Eden had experienced in the Suez Crisis of October 1956, but on the whole, there was also no great successes. Macmillan sought to avoid issues if possible, to strengthen contacts with the United States and the Commonwealth by personal diplomacy, to follow Washington's policy as closely as possible without appearing openly obsequious, and to hold a fairly tight rein over the Conservative Party and the House of Commons. An endless series of nasty little problems were met and somehow disposed of, to be followed by the rise of similar problems without any significant changes of course or speed. Abroad, the chief problems arose from the demands of various areas within the Commonwealth for self-government and the intrusions of the racial issue into these disputes, especially in Central Africa, East Africa, British Guiana, and Malaya. The chief problems at home were equally endless and were concerned with the continual weakness of the pound sterling on the foreign exchange market and the social problems associated with the British economic expansion, such as increased vehicular traffic, spreading juvenile and adolescent delinquency, an apparent decline in the level of adult moral behavior, and the growing attacks, especially in industry and finance, on the economic basis of the older establishment. In general, there was a slow spreading disillusionment with the structure of English society, especially with the continued dominance by the old established families of political and economic life. This was especially notable among the middle and lower classes, while the middle and lower middle classes, while the lower classes was apparently less antagonistic because of the continued relative prosperity and, above all, from the weakening of what might be called the Labor Party ideology of class conflict. In spite of a weakening of class antagonisms, there was a spreading rejection of the established class structure of England as it had existed for about a century. The good manners of the lower and middle classes, which had made visits to England such a pleasure, have slowly worsened, since they have come to be regarded as a mark of acceptance of the rigid class structure of the country, something that is decreasing in all classes. This shift is evident even in legislation, such as the Act of 1963, permitting peers to give up their titles in order to run for office in the House of Commons. It is, perhaps, most threatening in the animosity expressed by some of the new class of very rich who reject the established social prestige of older aristocratic families. This last point is of some importance, for it may mark the end of a very significant period of English history. In this history, the English social structure was retained because of its flexibility rather than its rigidity. Access to higher social levels had never been closed to those with the energy and luck to work upward. These climbers invariably became strong defenders of the class structure, buying country houses, sending their children to boarding schools, and adopting the accent and other distinctive idiosyncrasies of the English upper classes. This aping of their betters on all levels preserved the English class structure and provided the relatively frictionless character of English social life. Frictions have now appeared at the very time that the class antagonisms have been weakened. The reason for this has been the slow spreading in Britain of a kind of individualistic and nominalistic outlook that had been prevalent in much of the Western world for several generations, but had been played down in Britain until the last decade or so by the pressures to conform on those who wished to rise socially and even on those who wished to remain in their same social level. As a result, traditionally in England, individualists have been eccentrics, that is, persons so well established that their social position could not be changed notably by their personal behavior. This is now changing. Increasingly, those who wish to remain in their social status, and most significantly, a surprising number of those who are rising in the economic, academic, and political hierarchies, feel called upon to reject, in an explicit fashion, the established class structure. This began with the writings of Labor Party intellectuals early in the century, but it has now become so widespread that rising young men today still continue to rise without conforming to the established behavioral patterns of their aspirant levels. One reason for this, of course, is that control of the ladders to success are no longer so closely held. In the old days, the merchant bankers of London, EC2, controlled fairly well the funds that were needed for almost any enterprise to become a substantial success. Today, much larger funds are available from many diverse sources, from abroad, from government sources, from insurance and pension funds, from profit of other enterprises, and from other sources. These are no longer held under closely associated controls and are much more impersonal and professionalized in their disposal, so that on the whole, an energetic man or group with a good idea can get access to larger funds today and can do so without anyone much caring if he accepts the established social precedents. At the same time, on lower levels, young men working their way upward, although not perhaps to the top, no longer conform in dress and behavior to the expected patterns of respectability of their social aspirations, but often show a more or less open defiance of these. The most obvious and, in a way, most frightening examples of this are to be found in the open defiance of all respectability by adolescents and post adolescents of various social levels, but chiefly low ones, who have rioted by the thousands at various seaside resorts on long weekends in recent years. These most obvious examples of rebellion against English conformity are, however, not nearly so significant as the less obvious but much more significant rejections of the established system by men whose training and positions would lead us to expect that they would be firm supporters of it. This includes men like the following: 1. John Grigg, who disclaimed his title of Lord Altrincham in 1963, was educated at Eton and New College, was in the Grenadier Guards, edited the National Review, which had been acquired from Lady Milner, and was close to the establishment from his father's long-time associations with the Milner Group, the Times, the Round Table, and his intimate friendship with Lord Brand. The son shocked the court by his open criticism of the Queen's social associations as undemocratic, and his weekly articles for The Guardian advocated, among other things, abolition of the hereditary House of Lords, or to Goronwy Rees of New College and All Souls, who had denounced the English amateur tradition in government and business as a cult of incompetence and demanded to replace it. A system of training and recruitment that will provide a British managerial class marked by professional competence rather than by what he regards as frivolity. Or 3. John Viese, one-time scholar of Queen's College, Cambridge, and now Fellow of Worcester College, Oxford, who denounces the whole English educational system as inadequate and misguided and would replace it with something more like the French openly competitive system of free education. One perhaps surprising voice in this criticism aimed at attitudes rather than class structure has been that of Prince Philip. He has tried, with only moderate success, to introduce scientists, technicians, and managerial types into the court circles, at least occasionally, but these circles continue, as in the past, to be dominated by the old, rural, upper-class interest of horses, hunting, and parlor games. At the same time, by a series of calculated indiscretions, His Royal Highness has sought to encourage the change of attitude that so many feel is essential to the continued survival of Britain in an era of advanced technology. Samples of his statements continue to be quoted, especially in circles that disapprove of them. In February 1961, the Prince said, "If anyone has a new idea in this country, there are twice as many people who advocate putting a man with a red flag in front of him." And 18 months later, in a speech on Britain's inability to remain competitive in the world export markets, he said, "We are suffering a national defeat comparable to any lost military campaign, and what is more, a self-inflicted one. The bastions of the smug and the stick in the mud can only be toppled by persistent undermining." These criticisms of complacency, now a chronic disease of the British upper classes, have had relatively small influences, at least in those circles where they are most needed and where they are discreetly regarded as unfortunate remarks. However, the volume of such criticism, especially on relatively high levels of the established hierarchies, has been growing and must eventually force significant changes of outlook and behavior. They are more effective evidence of the breakdown of established outlooks than more spectacular events like the antics of juvenile rioters or even the sinful lives of cabinet ministers exposed in the popular press for the whole world to see, as was done of the war minister's encounters with a teenage prostitute whom he met of all places at Lady Astor's Cliveden estate. Seems like this has been going on for a long time. It seems possible, however, that any constructive change in England will be so long delayed that it may be anticipated by waves of unconstructive change, especially the rapid spread of frantic materialism, self indulgence, and undisciplined individualism. That this should occur in the country that offered the world of the 20th century its finest examples of self disciplined response to the calls of social duty would indeed be a profound tragedy. It would seem that Britain, perhaps more than any other European country except Sweden, is passing through a critical phase where it does not know what it wants or what it should seek. The patterns of outlook and behavior that brought it to world leadership by 1880 were going to cede by 1938. There was sufficient vitality still left in them to bring forth the magnificent effort of 1940 to 1945, but since 1945 it has become clear that the old patterns are not adapted to success in the contemporary world of technocracy, operations research, rationalization, and mass mobilization of resources. The British method of operating through a small elite, coordinated by leisurely personal contact and shared outlooks, and trained in the humanities, cannot handle the problems of the late 20th century. Britain has the quality to do this, for as we have seen, operations research, jet engines, radar, and many of the technological advances that helped create the contemporary world originated in Britain. But these things must be available on a mass basis for any country wishing to retain a position of substantial world leadership today, and they cannot be made available in Britain on a quantity basis of any continuation of the patterns of training and recruitment used by Britain in the 19th century. There are those who say, in all sincerity, that there is no need for Britain to seek to retain a position of leadership that would require it to destroy everything that made the country distinctive. These people are prepared to abandon world leadership, international influence, and economic expansion for the sake of preserving the late 19th century patterns of life and society. But pressures from outside as well as from within make this impossible. Lycurgus renounced social change in prehistoric Sparta only by militarizing the society. Britain certainly cannot refuse to change and at the same time hope to retain the leisurely, semi-aristocratic, informally improvising social structure of its recent past. The outside world is not prepared to allow this, and above all, the mass of British people will not allow it. In fact, the reluctance of the Conservative Party under Macmillan to face up to this problem has pushed a large number of British voters reluctantly towards the Labour Party. As a result, Labour won the election of October 1964 by a bare majority of the House of Commons. This is widely agreed that Britain's problems in facing the contemporary world fall under two headings: A. A rather complacent lack of enterprise, and B. An educational system that is not adapted to the contemporary world. The lack of enterprise is rooted in the self satisfied attitude of the established elite, especially in their rather unimaginative attitude towards industry and business. For example, at the time that the Volkswagen was sweeping the American small car import markets, the British motor corporations had in the Morris Minor a car that was slightly inferior in a few points, superior on several important points, and sold for several $100s less. Yet no real effort was made by the British firm to fight for a share of the American market. Critics of contemporary England tend to concentrate their fire on the educational system, which, despite great changes, remains inadequate in the sense that large numbers of young people are not being trained for the tasks that have to be done, especially for teaching itself. To be sure, Britain has provided about $3 billion on new educational buildings since the war, with about 100,000 more teachers, an extension in the school leaving age of about 18 months, and a six-fold increase in opportunities for higher education. With new universities being established in provincial towns almost yearly, but the subjects studied, the methods used, and the attitudes towards these are not directed towards the need of the future world. No real coordination or ready access is provided between the educational system and the world of action, and access to either by ordinary Englishmen remains restricted by social and economic barriers. That is one of the biggest problems with the entire world education system, is that they're not preparing people for actual jobs in the actual world. It's like, what are they even there for? Like, really? Instead of the gradual elimination of those who are unwilling to study, such as operates in theory in France and to a lesser extent in the United States, Britain still has barriers at ages 11 to 18 that shunt the major part of the country's young people into terminating and specialized curricula, and do so on largely irrelevant criteria, such as ability to pay or social background. A survey of more than 4,000 children, reported by Thomas Pakenham in The Observer, concluded that the 11 plus examination and our selective educational system itself are seriously biased in favor of middle class children and against virtually all those from poorer families. Using IQ tests that are themselves biased in favor of middle class children, the survey showed that of all 8-year-old children with IQs of 105, only 12% of lower class children were subsequently able to get to grammar schools, while 46% of those from middle class could get to grammar schools, and thus get access to a curriculum preparing for college. Of 8-year-olds with IQs of 111, 30% from the lower classes, but 60% of a higher social background subsequently reached grammar school. And of those exceptional children with IQs above 126, about 82% of both social levels get to grammar school. These figures are taken from a recent volume edited by Arthur Kessler, entitled Suicide of a Nation, Hutchinson, 1963. The significance of the volume does not rest so much in what it says as in the fact that a team of writers, including Kessler, Hugh Seton Watson, Malcolm Muggeridge, Cyril Connolly, Austin Albu, MP, Henry Farrell, John Mandard, Michael Shanks, and others could contribute to a volume with the rhetorical title borne by this one, Damn, I didn't know Michael Shanks was in the British Parliament. Several of these writers apply to the ruling groups of contemporary Britain the designation that Gilbert Murray, more than a generation ago, taught their elders to use with reference to ancient Athens, a failure of nerve. There may indeed be a failure of nerve in both historical cases, but there is equally evident a failure of imagination and of energy. For the Britain that won glory in World War II had many opportunities to do great things in the post war period, but failed to do so because its leaders were unwilling to grasp the opportunity. Sounds familiar. On the whole, two contending political parties in Britain continue to offer the mass of English voters opposing visions that have no real appeal to the great majority of English and at the same time show an obvious disinclination to take drastic action to realize these visions, probably because party leaders know that their views are repugnant to the majority. These two opposed visions offer, on the one hand, a nostalgic yearning of the conservatives for the world of 1908, and the other side, the state socialism and unilateral disarmament of the Labor Party doctrinaires. Neither of these has much to contribute to the real problems facing Britain in the last half of the 20th century, which is why the mass of British voters who can detect irrelevance even when they themselves have no clear knowledge of what is relevant have little enthusiasm for either. The conservative stand-patters were challenged by a number of vigorous and able veterans of World War II, such as Ian MacLeod, Peter Thornycroft, Quentin Hogg, Lord Hailsham, Reginald Malding, Enoch Powell, Ted Heath, and others. These were essentially empiricists, but they wanted conservatism to make an active attack on Britain's problems and to make their party more appealing to the great mass of Englishmen by associating it with vigor and social consciousness. Conscience. In one way or another, Macmillan was able to sidetrack all of these, to derail the traditional leader of the older aristocratic conservative families, Lord Salisbury, and to block other significant contenders for control of the party such as R.A. Butler. In fact, Macmillan's eagerness to avoid decisions or activity in matters concerned with the welfare of the country was exceeded only by his activity in consolidating his own personal power in the party. In some ways, notably in his insatiable yearning for power, his skill in concealing this fact, and his evident lack of any very rigid principles on other matters. Macmillan recalled his predecessor, Baldwin. Both had the same pose as typical country squires, and both had Oxford University closer to their hearts than any other public issue. But where Baldwin was lethargic and relatively sensitive, Macmillan was active and secretly ruthless, quite willing, apparently, to disrupt the establishment or the party itself to further his personal position and his surprisingly narrow social interest. This was seen in his last minute successful campaign against Sir Oliver Franks for the honorary position of Chancellor of Oxford in 1960, and in the way in which, operating from a hospital bed in 1963, he pushed aside all other claimants to be his successor as Prime Minister to put into that office the 14th Earl of Home, Alexander Frederick Douglass Home. This disregard of tradition, of the lines of expected procedure, of the claims of past service and cooperation, and above all, of the expectation of public opinion in order to raise a man whose chief claim seemed to many to be based on long lineage, was a fair commentary on Macmillan's attitude towards his office and his party. Its influence on the morale of the party itself cannot be assessed, but it cannot have been a good one. The Labour Party was similarly divided and similarly fell under the control of a man whose will to power was stronger than any ideology or party principles. On the whole, the party was split between leaders of labor union origin and intellectuals from jobs in university teaching. At the same time, it was split between those who still saw some merit in the old theories of class struggles and imperialist wars and felt that the solution to both was to be found in nationalization of industry and drastic, if not unilateral, disarmament, at least in regard to nuclear weapons. The post war world, in Britain as elsewhere, violated all the anticipations of Socialist Party theories. The former socialist utopia, the Soviet Union, became the archenemy, and the United States, previously regarded as the epitome of capitalist corruption, became a combination of St. George and Santa Claus. The post war experience with nationalization disillusioned all but the most doctrinaire of socialists and the majority of voters once they had obtained the basic elements of social welfare, medical care, and social insurance in the immediate post-war period, showed a strange preference for moderate or even conservative leaders rather than for the advocates of left-wing policies. As a consequence of these experiences, the Labour Party tended to split into a major wing that sought to win votes and office by appeals to moderation and a minor wing that sought to repeat the older war cries for seeking working class benefits through class legislation and nationalization. The disappearance from the scene of the pre-war Labour Party leaders such as Clement Attlee, Ernest Bevin, and Hugh Dalton made Hugh Gaitskell leader of the party and of its moderate wing. By 1956, Gaitskell was being challenged from the left by Frank Cousins, a former miner who was backed by 1,000,000 votes in the Transport and General Workers Union. At the party conference of 1960, Gaitskell was defeated on 4 resolutions favoring unilateral disarmament and rejecting British cooperation with NATO, which were passed over his objections. Gaitskell was able to reverse these votes in 1961, but could not wipe from the public mind the impression that the party might not be completely reliable in support of Britain's role in the defense of the West against communist aggressions. While still concerned with this task, Gaitskell died early in 1963 and was succeeded by party leader Harold Wilson, whose brilliant record as student and teacher did not hamper his work as a skilled and tireless manipulator of intra-party political influence. From 1959 onward, a small but steady sagging in popular support for the conservatives was evident. The party delayed calling a new election until the very end of the 5-year term of the Parliament's life in the vain hope that some success, or at least some decisive improvement in Britain's economic condition, might provide the margin for an unprecedented 4th consecutive electoral victory. By late 1960, it was clear that some decisive step must be taken to regain popular support. Macmillan was driven, still with reluctance, to seek membership for Britain in the booming European Economic Community. Application was made in August 1961, opening many months of onerous negotiation. During this period, de Gaulle made a spectacular state visit to West Germany, spoke of national glories of Germany, and persuaded Chancellor Adenauer to sign a special treatment of Franco-German friendship whose real meaning was ambiguous to all concerned, except that it seemed to exclude both the great English-speaking powers from their inner European circle. The latter two reaffirmed their solidarity in what looked to some like British inferiority to Washington. In a conference between Macmillan and President Kennedy in the Bahamas in December 1962. The Nassau Conference sought to iron out various Anglo-American differences, to agree on steps that might avert de Gaulle's steady weakening of NATO, and on Macmillan's part, to show the British electorate the conservative leader's close relations with President Kennedy. The meeting confirmed an American decision to abandon the Skybolt, an air-to-ground missile on which the British had constructed much of their nuclear defense, and proposed to strengthen NATO by establishing a multinational force. The latter project hoped to establish NATO's strategic nuclear force in a fleet of surface naval vessels armed with Polaris-type missiles and operated by mixed crews from all the NATO powers. These mixed crews would prevent France from continuing its divisive policies within the NATO military array, increase the cohesion of Europe, give its nuclear strategy at least an appearance of independence from the United States, and provide the groundwork from some kind of European defense community, including Britain, if France split NATO completely. De Gaulle's answer to this weak and symbolic gesture of Anglo-American cooperation was decisive. Within less than a month, in January 1963, he rejected the British 17-month-old application to join the EEC. This resounding defeat to Macmillan and the United States was delivered in typical de Gaulle fashion. In superb disregard of the established EEC procedures for dealing with applications for membership, de Gaulle, at a personal press conference, announced that France would oppose the British request on the grounds that it was a belated effort to get into a system that the British had earlier sought to impede with their rival Outer Seven Free Trade Area, and that Britain was not yet ready for admission to any purely European system since, as he said, Britain in effect is insular, maritime, and linked by her trade, her markets, and her suppliers to a great variety of countries, many of them distant, so that the nature, structure, and circumstances of Britain differ profoundly from those of continental states. If Britain were admitted to EEC, according to de Gaulle, she would at once seek to bring in all other members of the OECD, and in the end, there would appear a colonial Atlantic community under American dominance and leadership which would completely swallow up the European community. The other 5 EEC nations, with Britain and the United States, opposed to de Gaulle's efforts to break off the Brussels talks on the British application for membership, but on January 29, 1963, the French vetoed continuance of the discussion, and the British application was, in effect, rejected. The de Gaulle veto suspended indefinitely the movement towards Europe's political unity. At the same time, de Gaulle rejected the Anglo-American suggestion for a multinational nuclear force within NATO. On January 22, 1963, with President Adenauer of West Germany, he signed the French-German Treaty of Friendship and Consultation, providing periodic conferences of the two countries on foreign policy, defense, and cultural matters. Before the end of the month, over strong Labour Party opposition, the British Parliament approved the Anglo-American Nassau Pact and heard Prime Minister Macmillan announce his government's determination to build an independent nuclear force of 4 or 5 British-built Polaris submarines by purchasing the necessary equipment from the United States. In this way, the movement for European unity was suspended and the continent remained at 6s and 7s. Are you kidding me? This condition of stalemate was protracted for almost 2 years through 1963 and 1964 by extensive governmental changes and important national elections. In February 1963, the Conservative government of Prime Minister Diefenbaker of Canada was overthrown on a no confidence vote based on charges that he had failed in vigor in supplying warheads for Canada's section of the North American defense system. He was replaced by a Liberal government headed by Lester B. Pearson. In the same month, in England, the death of the Labour Party leader Gaitskell brought to the head of the opposition group, a relatively unknown left wing intellectual and former university instructor, Harold Wilson, who had often supported Aneurin Bevan against Gaitskell's more moderate views. In June 1963, the whole movement for Christian religious reunion and reform of the Catholic Church was suspended by the death of the very popular Pope John the 23rd and installation of his successor, Pope Paul VII. In October, one of the semi-permanent fixtures of the European post-war political scene disappeared when the 87-year-old Chancellor Konrad Adenauer resigned after a 14-year term. He was replaced in the chancellorship by Economic Minister Ludwig Erhard, who was widely regarded as the chief architect of Germany's spectacular economic recovery. 3 days after Adenauer's resignation, Harold Macmillan, on grounds of ill health, resigned as Prime Minister and was able to impose on his party as his successor the ex-Earl of Home, renamed Sir Alec Douglas Home. Thus, the British general election of 1964 was fought with new leaders on both sides. A few weeks after the shift of government in London, a more significant change of government took place in Rome as part of a long-term shift to the left in the Italian political balance. Essentially, the dominant Christian Democratic group broke free, to some extent, from its reactionary right wing and from the need to seek support on the right by detaching the left-wing socialists from their long and uncomfortable alliance with the communists by bringing this group into the government and leaving the communists almost completely isolated on the left. Aldo Moro, political secretary of the Christian Democratic Party, became premier of the new arrangement in December 1963, with Pietro Nini of left-wing socialist as deputy premier. In theory, the coalition rested on an agreement to seek to extend the benefits of the Italian prosperity boom to the less affluent workers group who had been relatively neglected in the hysterical pursuit of profits by more affluent entrepreneurs under the preceding governments. The Italian cabinet shift was still in process when President Kennedy was assassinated by an unstable political fanatic in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. This, in view of the power and influence of the American presidency, was the most significant governmental change for many years. After an unprecedented display of worldwide mourning, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, took control of the American presidency's global responsibilities and national obligations with only 11 months in which to establish his position as a candidate in the presidential election of 1964. As a consequence of these changes, the removal from office of Khrushchev in October 1964 and the death that year of Jawaharlal Nehru, who had been Prime Minister of India from the achievement of independence in 1947, the governments of all countries except France and Red China underwent significant shifts of personnel in the period of about 15 months. This gave rise to a pause in world history for almost all of 1963 to 1964, during which each country placed increased emphasis on its domestic problems, especially on the demands of its citizens for increased prosperity, civil rights, and social security. Since the same tendency became evident also in France and Red China, where the previous leaders continued in power, the last 2 years covered by this book were years of hesitation, decreased world tension, and confused plans for future courses. All right. Conclusion. Tragedy and hope. The tragedy of the period covered by this book is obvious, but the hope may seem dubious to many. Only the passage of time will show if the hope I seem to see in the future is actually there, or is the result of misobservation and self-deception. The historian has difficulty distinguishing the features of the present and generally prefers to restrict his studies to the past, where the evidence is more freely available and where perspective helps him to interpret the evidence. Thus, the historian speaks with decreasing assurance about the nature and significance of events as they approach his own day. The time covered by this book seems to this historian to fall into three periods: the 19th century from about 1814 to about 1895, the 20th century, which did not begin until after World War II, perhaps as late as 1950, and a long period of transition from 1895 to 1950. The nature of our experiences in the first two of these periods is clear enough, while the character of the third, in which we have been for only half a generation, is much less clear. A few things do seem evident, notably that the 20th century now forming is utterly different from the 19th century, and that the age of transition between the two was one of the most awful periods in all of human history. Some, looking back on the 19th century across the horrors of the age of transition, may regard it with nostalgia or even envy. But the 19th century was, however hopeful in its general processes, a period of materialism, selfishness, false values, hypocrisy, and secret vices. It was the working of these underlying evils that eventually destroyed the century's hopeful qualities and emerged in all their nakedness to become dominant in 1914. Nothing is more revealing of the nature of the 19th century than the misguided complacency and optimism of 1913 and early 1914, and the misconceptions with which the world's leaders went to war in August 1914. The events of the following 30 years, from 1913 to 1945, showed the real nature of the preceding generation, its ignorance, complacency, and false values. Two terrible wars, sandwiching a world economic depression, revealed man's real inability to control his life by the 19th century's techniques of laissez-faire, materialism, competition, selfishness, nationalism, violence, and imperialism. These characteristics of late 19th century life culminated in World War II, in which more than 50 million persons, 23 million of them in uniform, the rest civilians, were killed, most of them by horrible deaths. The hope of the 20th century rests on its recognition that war and depression are man-made and needless. They can be avoided in the future by turning from the 19th century characteristics just mentioned and going back to other characteristics that our Western society has always regarded as virtues: generosity, compassion, cooperation, rationality, and foresight, and finding an increased role in human life for love, spirituality, charity, and self-discipline. We know now, fairly well how to control the increase in population, how to produce wealth, and reduce poverty or disease. We may, in the near future, know how to postpone senility and death. It certainly should be clear to those who have their eyes open that violence, extermination, and despotism do not solve problems for anyone, and that victory and conquest are delusions as long as they are merely physical and materialistic. Some things we clearly do not yet know, including the most important of all, which is how to bring up children to form them into mature, responsible adults. But on the whole, we do know now, as we have already shown, that we can avoid continuing the horrors of 1914 to 1945, and on that basis alone, we may be optimistic over our ability to go back to the tradition of our Western society and to resume its development along its old patterns of inclusive diversity. That's the end of the book. All right. Really appreciate the 4 people that have been watching the videos. I don't know who you are. You're just ghost watchers or whatever, but I appreciate it. You know, I don't really know what else to say about it. Good book, kinda. A lot of conspiracy stuff in there. Pretty interesting. I learned a lot of different stuff too. So, yeah, that's it. That's the end of tragedy and hope. Maybe there's some hope for the future. Who knows? We'll see, I guess. So that's it. Thanks for watching the video. If you did, if you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.